Okay, if everyone could kind of take their seats, and we're going to go ahead and think about getting started here. Just want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone. Great to see so many friends here. And it gives me personal great pleasure to welcome our friends from AmCham Shanghai here today to CSIS. I can't say enough how much we enjoy our collaboration with all of the AmCham organizations in China, whether it's Beijing, Shanghai. We don't have as much interaction as we might like with some of the others, and we hope that this will be a model for opportunities for them to come and see us at some point and present their views as well. But it gives me particular pleasure this afternoon to welcome Ken Jarrett, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Ken is not only an amazing individual, but a great personal friend. We've worked together very closely for a very long time, both in government and then he beat me to diving into the sea of private enterprise, and and now I'm there with him here at CSIS. Ken, of course, was a U.S. diplomat from 1982 to 2008. His postings included Consul General in Shanghai from July 2005 to 2008, Deputy Consul General in Hong Kong, and Director of Asian Affairs at the White House National Security Council. He also served in Beijing, Chengdu, Singapore, and had several assignments here in Washington, D.C. From 2008 to 2013, he was the Greater China Chairman for APCO Worldwide, a Washington-based public affairs consultancy, and he's been president of AmCham Shanghai since September 2013. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in History from Cornell University, his Master's in East Asian Studies and Chinese History from Yale, and his second Master's in National Security Studies from the National War College. Of course, Ken is fluent in Mandarin, having studied Chinese language at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Taipei Language Institute, and an advanced program with the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. So once again, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ken here to the stage. Please join me in welcoming.
So thank you, Chris, and thanks to CSIS for organizing this program today. And I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience, people I haven't had a chance to say hello to yet, but after the program, there'll be a chance to do that. It's a two-part program today. So I'm going to lead off with the results of our recent business climate survey, and then we'll have a panel discussion, and we hope as a result of these two sections to leave all of you with a better sense of how the American business community views conditions in China these days. So, there we go. So just a bit of background on the survey. For those who follow business climate, there are questions on HR-related issues such as the flow in and out of China of expatriate talent. This time around, we had a couple of questions on what our members were looking for from the Trump administration or the impact of the Trump administration on investment decisions, as well as a couple of sections on innovation. So I'm not going to go into all of those because I only have about 15 minutes or so this is really going to be on some of the highlights. And for those who want to see the full survey results, it's on our website, and so I have the link to that at the end of the presentation. So in terms of some of the just key numbers on the survey itself, so we had a good response this year. So 426 of our 1,500 corporate members. Most of the companies that responded to the survey have been in China a pretty long time. So this is a group of experienced China market veterans, which we feel also gives credibility to the survey itself. Obviously, the survey, you could argue that there's some slight bias built into the survey because we don't survey those people who have left China. So for those companies who've decided that the market has just become too difficult and they're not going to stay around, I think that's it's a relatively limited number, so that's not reflected in the survey, and so we acknowledge that, but the survey, it doesn't matter that much because you're comparing sort of the survey numbers over time. So some of the key survey numbers just on performance, so looking at a traditional sort of business performance metrics, whether, so are you profitable, now what's happening with your revenue growth, are margins improving or not. Here you will see that in our most recent survey, a very clear turn in direction. So after several years of numbers trending downward, most of the numbers have moved upward. So this does reflect the improved performance of companies, and if I were to summarize sort of the survey, what it is saying about the situation in China today, although we were to some degree actually a bit surprised at how strong the performance numbers were, and we feel we'll have to wait until next year, frankly, to see if this trend continues. But our assessment is that the survey numbers on performance reflect some of the stimulus that went into the Chinese economy as they entered into the 19th Party Congress year. The economy actually has been relatively strong this past year, and U.S. companies have been benefiting from this. So whether or not this is a long-term trend, we don't know. Certainly, I wouldn't expect the trend line to continue to be as sharply upward as this survey shows, because the policy environment for companies hasn't really improved, and so we'll get to that later. So in that sense, the survey it's two stories, because you have this improved performance, so you can't argue with that. But the fact is that if you were to ask companies about the regulatory environment in which they operate in, so their companies have not seen that much positive change. In terms of, to get into a little bit of detail in terms of which industries are doing better in terms of profitability, non-consumer electronics, healthcare, manufacturing, chemicals, automotive, retail, and consumer were all profitable at the 85%, meaning 85% or more of companies in those sectors were all profitable. If you were to break out the data for small and medium-sized companies and defining these as companies with global revenue of under 50 million US dollars, only 61% were profitable. So this is a contrast, and to some degree it makes sense. The smaller companies are maybe new to market, they're not as familiar with China, and it takes them a bit of time to understand how the market operates and to get to that level of profitability, while the bigger companies have been in China much longer and have a higher level of profitability. Some of these other points I'll get into in terms of investment level and optimism. And this is just to give you a quick overview, but I'll get into those in a bit more detail. Revenue growth. So here also, as the first slide showed, this just breaks it down in terms of the degree of revenue growth by segments. So you have, there we are. Whoops. Or maybe I won't bother to try to use a pointer. So the darker the color, the better it is for companies. So in revenue growth, as the first slide showed, there has been an improvement in revenue growth in general across the board. Manufacturing had the strongest recovery. 2015 for manufacturing in China was a tough year for many companies, and that explains the rebound in 2016. But in manufacturing, 71% of manufacturing companies had improved revenue growth as opposed to what was a 54% across the board. Retail and services also were fairly strong, even actually stronger than manufacturing. But in terms of a change in revenue growth, it was strongest for the manufacturing sector. And 50% of our members who responded to the survey said that they had higher revenue growth in China compared to their global growth. So this is also something that we use as a metric, just how are companies doing compared to what they are doing on a global basis. Investment increases. This also a key metric. Here the picture is somewhat mixed. It was not as strong as 2016, and so here as it's 2014. I have to point out here that if you look at 2015, so we had changed the question a little bit. So as you do comparisons, we're making it complicated for ourselves to do an apple-to-apple comparison, unfortunately, by redefining the question. So here you really want to compare 2016 to what the trends were for 2013 and 2014. So 2016, 55% of our members are reporting a plan to increase their investment, and this is a little bit less than what had been the trend before. So previously we had been more at the 64-65% level for investment growth, and if you were to, and in fact for this year, so one of the questions in the survey is what are your plans for investment growth in 2017, and we won't know until next year exactly what that translates into, but at least the plan for this year was 63% of the respondents said that they plan to increase their investments. So that actually would take us back to what has been more of a historical norm in this area. Another question we asked in this area of investment growth was, where does China rank in terms of your global investment priorities? This is a question we've asked for a number of years, and 23.6% of the respondents said that China was number one for their number one global investment priority, but this is a drop of about 5.5% from the previous year. So there's been some attrition in terms of investment, but investment is still taking place. So if I were to, on the other side of the coin, in terms of those industries that are seeing higher levels of investment, a few of these would be agriculture and food. So 77% are planning to increase investment, healthcare at 76%, and the auto industry at 72%. And all these, I think, have a pretty strong logic behind it if you look at the growing consumer, the middle class and consumption in China. So food and ag, this is something where foreign products have an inherent advantage in the safety and security side of the equation. Healthcare, a high priority as well. And of course, the auto industry in China is doing quite well. The optimism index. So each year we ask companies how they're feeling about their long-term outlook in China. And here are the answers. It's relatively flat. So not relatively, it's 80%. There's a little bit of a change in the mix in terms of very optimistic and slightly optimistic. But here, this reflects, I would argue, the challenges that companies simply face here in China today, where we have a relatively subdued level of optimism. What actually would be a benchmark for optimism? I can't give you an answer compared to other markets around the world. So the only way really to benchmark this, frankly, is to look at the past levels in China. And if you go back a year has passed, the optimism level in China has been very high. Maybe you would argue it's actually been off the charts practically, and it wasn't justified to be as high as it has been, but it's been sort of in the 90% level for a number of years, but now we're only at the 80% level. By industry, optimism is strongest in the retail industry, in the retail sector. So that's at 83%. The differences here are relatively fine. So whether they're significant or not, you'll have to make that decision yourself. So retail at 83%, manufacturing at 81%, and services at 78%. So not a huge difference. So to change gears a little bit, so the next few slides will turn to some of the challenges that companies face. So we'll look at this from the angle of regulatory challenges, operational challenges, issues of government favoritism or not. Basically, these are questions that deal with the issue of what is it that hinders a business success for U.S. companies in China. And we'll start with the regulatory challenges. So here you have a list of them. So I'm not going to read this out, but you see, the top three would be getting required licenses, IPR, intellectual property rights, protection and enforcement, and data security and protection of commercial secrets. And the third one, this is a relatively new issue that companies are facing, and one that years back wasn't even on the survey, but in the couple of years that we put it on the survey, it's quickly rising, high on the list of concerns for U.S. companies. And this is it's a higher concern for financial services. If you were to break out the response to this question by industry, for the financial services industry, 77% ranked this as a hindrance. So the importance here is to look at it's a serious hindrance or some hindrance. This is the way we define whether or not these challenges get in the way of companies' performance. In the case of small and medium-sized enterprises, here, too, they had a special concern, which is internet restrictions. So for an SME operating in China, the ability to have sort of unhindered internet access is very critical for them. So concerns about the firewall in China, and these days, VPN access, if you're trying to get beyond the firewall, these are things that weigh heavily on the mind of smaller companies in China. The level playing field issue. So we can get at this from a number of different perspectives. So there's several questions here on whether or not our members feel that the Chinese government favors local companies. And so here the conclusion is yes. So it's 55% indicate that there is favoritism toward local companies. That is a slight drop from the previous year. So it's gone from 59 to 55%. But if you were to cross-check that response to a couple of other questions, and I don't have slides on them, but I'm giving you the conclusions on the side. This is 40% of our members say that policies have remained the same, or 33% said worsened. And the 40, how do you interpret the 40% that say it remains the same? In general, I would say that that's not a 40% figure that is enthusiastic about the existing policies. So usually there's a sort of implicit in that a sense that these policies are disadvantageous for U.S. companies. And you have 28% say that there has been some improvement in terms of the regulatory regime. 60% felt that the regulatory regime lacks transparency. So you have another 40% that actually said that they felt that the regulatory system was transparent, and that was something that, so that's an increase from the past. So in the previous year it had been just 28%, and so that's a significant jump, and a question that we'll be watching carefully next year to see if this is a trend that's going to sustain itself, because it actually is the third year that this number has grown. So it's gone in the course of 3 years from 15% to 28% to 40%. So that's a pretty significant change, and the question of why that might be the case is one that we scratched our heads about for quite some time. And our conclusion really is to link this to the greater practice of the Chinese government to put draft regulations out for comment and to seek input from industry, because that is something that we have noticed much more of, and our member companies have seen that as well. Operational challenges. So here, actually no change in the top three. So for quite some time now, it's been the rising costs of doing business, domestic competition. A competition here mainly coming from private companies. So when we break this down in questions, it's not so much the state-owned enterprises that our members are worried about. It's really the private companies that are becoming much stronger. And then internet restrictions here, you can see this sort of coming to the top of the list. And then, I guess sticking with, so in terms of intellectual property rights, so on the survey, a number of questions about intellectual property from various angles, and one was to ask members about the impact of IPR protection on their investment in R&D. In China, moving in the direction of more innovative-based society is an important objective for the Chinese government, but how to encourage greater investment in research and development is linked to the sense of confidence that companies have that their IP will be protected. So here you can see that, so 40% of our members, and this was a new question this year, so I don't have a comparison for you, but 40% of our members feel that the absence of sufficient intellectual property rights protection does inhibit their investment in R&D in China. So that's something that we hope the Chinese government will be mindful of as they continue to improve their intellectual property rights regime. And this feeling was actually much stronger in the manufacturing industry. So I don't have the number in front of me, but that was the group that was most worried about intellectual property rights protection and its link to R&D. And then getting, so just the last couple of slides. So we did ask our members. So keep in mind that the survey, I didn't actually mention this at the beginning, but the survey was conducted at the very end of April and early May. So just to give you a time frame for when we collected the data. So the Trump administration was in place, and we did ask our members to identify what they would define as the top trade priority for the new administration. And the response was actually a multilateral approach was what they favored the most. This also sort of surprised us a little bit. So this is a 33%, pursue a multilateral free trade agreement. I think so my explanation for this response is that if you're in the business community and looking at what's going to do the most for you, then obviously a multilateral approach is going to take away the most sort of market access barriers for you. And it makes sense for the business community for members to highlight this as their number one response. We were somewhat surprised that the bilateral investment treaty sort of ranked relatively low in this pecking order of top picks. But again, I would just highlight the contrast. A multilateral has a greater prospect for giving you more wins than a purely bilateral approach. There are a couple of other questions related to the new Trump administration. One was the impact of the Trump administration on investment plans in China, and 65% of the respondents said that there was no impact on their investment plans. 18% were uncertain, and only 12% were reviewing their plans as a result of the change here in Washington. And we asked a question about the use of investment reciprocity. So I have to be very specific in terms of how this question is phrased. So I'm almost going to read the way the question read in the report, which was, should the U.S. government use investment reciprocity as a tool to gain greater market access in China? So that was a question, and 40% of our members said yes. 44% said that they were unsure. Now, this is the first time we asked this question, and I'm not actually surprised at the unsure rate. The 40% rate strikes me as a strong response, frankly, to this question, and we'll have to see what happens next year. But that strong response does reflect the frustration among many of our members with market access issues here in China. So that's the quick summary of the survey, just to leave you with some highlights of what it all means, and you can have a look at that on your own almost. But if you want to see the full survey, so again, it is on the website. For those who like data, the survey goes back 15 or 16 years, so we have these surveys on the website. You can do endless comparisons of what has changed over time, and you can look forward to our next survey in July of next year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Scott.
We're going to move those seats. All right. Just give us 10 seconds while we wait do some magic and add some seats. We've got, I'm Scott Kenneth, I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair. My mic. Let me get my mic. I do a lot of research on technology. I have no idea how to use it. There we go. All right. I think we're ready to come up on the stage. We've got a great group, including Ken, and we're going to have a roundtable conversation about what the American business community and what the view is from Shanghai. So if the panelists would all join me up here, we'll continue the conversation. And we'll make sure no chairs slip off the back or anything like that. I want to make sure we're okay. Good. We can't lose any speakers today. Terrific. Make sure we're time here. Right. Terrific. Again, I'm Scott Kennedy.
Ken, thanks a lot for the fantastic presentation. Thank you all for coming from Shanghai. I've been honored to be able to collaborate and engage with AmCham Shanghai over the last several years. I've been doing research, including on the 13th five-year plan and Chinese high-tech policy. And every time I've gone to Shanghai, I've been welcomed with open arms and had great conversations and really appreciate that. The only challenge, though, is every time I go there, it's really hot. So I was there in July, and it was 1,000,000 degrees. Maybe not exactly 1,000,000, but close to it. And we've given you a nice fall day here. A little bit warm, but not quite Shanghai hot. What we're going to do is let me introduce our panelists, and then we'll get to the discussion and hear their perspectives and how their individual experiences align or don't align maybe with some of the overall results in the survey. And then we'll have open up the conversation with everybody here in the audience. First, I'm going to introduce, in no particular, I'll start here with Pilar Dieter. She became a senior partner at Solidance earlier this year. She has served business-to-business clients across a wide range of industries. She's advised clients such as Johnson Controls, Corning, Honeywell, Mitsui, Caterpillar, and others. She has a master's in business sciences from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. To her left is Han Lin, who's the Deputy General Manager of Wells Fargo in China and a Senior Relationship Manager of Global Banking China. He joined Wells Fargo in 2004, moved to China in 2006, and like me, he has an MA from SAIS. All right, across the street. All right. To his left is Kerr Gibbs. Kerr is the chairman of AmCham Shanghai. He's held that role since 2016. Previously, he's had a long engagement with the Chamber's work. He's a private equity investor focused on technology and life sciences. He's worked for tech companies like Apple, where he led their Hong Kong-based software subsidiary. He has an MBA from UC Berkeley. To his left is Gentry Syed, who's the co-chair of the Asia practice for Kilpatrick Townsend. His practice focuses on international transactions, the FCPA, compliance, IP, dispute resolution, government relations, and inbound and outbound investment. He's worked in these topics in many different industries. And then we've already introduced Ken as well, so you can see we have a terrific group. I want to emphasize that this is a discussion about the view of China from Shanghai, right? And we have folks who've been in Shanghai quite some time. I know Kerr's been there since 2002, if I believe so. Han from 2006, I just mentioned. Gentry from 2005. And when did you first arrive in Shanghai?
5 as well.
2005, and Ken?
05.
05. So we've got folks who've been there about a decade or more. So you've seen a lot of ups and downs in the post-WTO era, which is terrific. In addition, we have several people in the audience who have spent time in Shanghai, worked there, including at least 2 consul generals for the United States who have served in the city as well. And it's a city of 25 million people, so we're not talking about a small place, right? We're many countries. I think Shanghai, if it were a country, it'd probably be like the 15th largest country in the world, right? So, it's particularly important because it's a manufacturing center. It also wants to be a financial center, and it feels very different, not just because it's hotter than Beijing, but because of all the other aspects as well. So let me open with an initial question to Ken, just to go back to the survey and some of the answers that you gave. So could you just give us a little bit more of a feel of the background and the process of carrying out the survey and sort of how that's changed over the years? And then if you could just pick out one thing, data point from the survey that you were most surprised by, that you didn't expect to see in the data, what would that one thing be?
Well, in the survey process, I mean, not to bore you too much with what takes place behind the scenes, but it is one that we work closely with our members, first asking ourselves there's a certain amount of data that we want to ask the same question from year to year, because that's what allows us to do the comparisons. But there are questions that are more topical or as we get a sense of emerging trends that we feel we want to poll our members on. There's this review of the question set. People suffer from survey fatigue, so you can't sort of press your luck too much. So we basically take the position that we would never exceed sort of 45 or so questions, and so every question that we want to add, we have to take one away. But we do try in the survey, there's a core set of questions on performance, investment, revenue, those types of issues, but then to take a look at things that might be of interest. So this survey in particular, so the questions on the Trump administration was an example of that. Last year we had a section on e-commerce because that was sort of a very hot issue. So there's always that part where we're trying to capture something that is very sort of top of mind for people. And we go out to companies with the draft questions to get their feedback before we go out with the survey itself. When we get the results, we partner with PwC, so they work with us on the survey. So the initial analysis, we try to get a focus group or two of companies where we will thrash out theories about why companies responded the way they do. So it takes about 6 months, at least, from start to finish. And then on the, I guess, the surprise numbers, I've already actually sort of tipped my hand on this one in terms of transparency. That was the one that surprised me, the fact that over the last 3 years, we've gone from 15 to 28 to 40% of our members feeling that the regulatory regime is more transparent. This surprises me because it doesn't really track with what I hear from companies. And perhaps this is a function of people come to us when there's something they're unhappy about, and when they're comfortable or when they're not unhappy, they don't bother to come to us. So it's perhaps that the 40%, the silent minority in this case, that we just don't hear about. So I was surprised at that figure.
Well, we'll get to ask some of those who were polled, and maybe they can offer us a little bit of an explanation. I like doing survey research. I don't always do it, but I'm very impressed by the surveys that AmCham Shanghai and the others do, and the consistency and the ability to look over time. I wish all AmChams around the world in Asia would do these, and then we'd be able to compare across countries as well, which is a point that you mentioned. But let me play surveyor today for the rest of the group. And let me ask a question for each of you, and then see if you could put it in the context of your own company's experiences. So let me ask the question, and then we'll go down the line and get your answers. And again, you can't pick the same answer as somebody else just because they picked it, right? So usually, and we can't have you cover your ears or anything. So we're not perfectly following the strict social science methodology, but we're going to try. So in the context of the last 3 to 5 years, would you say that business for your firm has gotten much easier in China, gotten a little easier, remained roughly the same, gotten a little more difficult, or gotten a lot more difficult? So first you're going to give your that basic answer, and then give us a little sense of what your company does in China, and then the areas of progress or challenges that led you to the result. And then that'll give us some stuff to dive into in follow-up. So we'll start with Paul.
Great. So as a consultant, it isn't very helpful for you to hear me respond to this from a consulting services standpoint. So allow me to do this on behalf of some of the manufacturing clients we work with. And we're pretty much focused in B2B markets. So I'll select automotive as an example. In the case of automotive, to stick with your survey process, I would say same game, different day. The reality of how it is that industries are operating and how U.S. businesses are performing in China is really one where they've had challenges throughout the last few decades. That hasn't changed. What has changed, however, is the maturity or the state of the market in which they're working in. So when we look at automotive as an example, one of the things that's becoming so sensational for automotive suppliers, and I'm talking about component manufacturers, is the rise of the aftermarket. We're talking about an opportunity for the aftermarket where there is less than, in the States we have something like 790 to every 1,000 people have a car density population, meaning for every 1,000 people you have almost 800 car owners. In China, that number is only 298 to every 1,000 people. What that represents is a huge opportunity for the aftermarket to be providing massive amounts of supply within the supply chain to the aftermarket component industry. Now, so that's the promise. The challenge, and what you'll hear from companies like Johnson Controls, Dana Automotive, even companies like Caterpillar that have components going in there as well, Emerson, pick a name, is what they refer to as genuine parts. And this is where you start to see things like the IP protection concern. This is where you start to see knockoff becoming a tangible challenge that they have to deal with. And I think really in the outlook of how it is that the automotive sector is going to be responding to this, they're really trying to understand the transparency comes with a lack of regulation enforcement. So when you hear US business requesting more transparency or more enforcement, it's not so much that they're criticizing the regulation. The regulation is there, it exists, and it's relatively clear. But what isn't clear is the way in which it's brought down. Province to province, city to city, distributor to distributor, it's not an even playing field. And that's, at least in the case of automotive, how I would see them facing challenge.
Jarrett, that's extremely clear, and thank you for picking an important sector as well. Han?
Okay, well, Wells Fargo is among a group of US banks that operate in China, primarily to provide strategic financing for US companies going out to China, but also to provide and meet the US needs of China companies coming over to the US. Now, to your question of whether the working environment is getting more difficult, the answer is slightly more. Okay. Now, slightly more is driven by the fact that the compliance standards for financial services have become more complex, but also it's not only the number of regulations, it's also how different they are compared to what we would expect in the US. Let me give you an illustration. Suppose all of you were a company and you were looking to borrow funds from a bank in order to pay your supplier. Now, in the US, you would simply withdraw funds from the bank and pay your supplier directly. But in China, it doesn't work that simple. In China, you have to first prove you have a relationship with your supplier. So the bank has to actually see a contract or invoices to show that you have a legitimate relationship with the supplier. Then the bank will directly wire funds to the supplier and not let you as a borrower directly touch those funds. After all, in that way, it mitigates the risk that you as a borrower might potentially take the funds and use it for purposes not meant to be intended for. So it's an example where the regulatory framework is different and these regulations have increased, but there's also an element of needing to explain it back to the US as well. Now, that said, these regulations are important because every financial needs them. And so it's no different for China. And as you might understand, China's financial system is growing substantially. So as a result, you would expect the regulatory environment to get more complex as well. Okay.
That's super helpful and not easy, really complicated. All right, Kurt, from investors' position or maybe some of the industries that you invest in?
Sure, Scott. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think when you ask a question like this, it kind of depends on from what perspective you're talking about. And Scott, I know you're a policy guy, so that's sort of embedded in the question. But when I look at it as an investor, it's a little bit different. So from an investment point of view, if you ask me, is business getting more difficult? Absolutely. I mean, it's much more difficult in the sense that it's a lot harder to get an effective return today. Why? Because it's a more mature, actually similar to answers that Pilar and Han gave in the sense that it's a more mature economy. It's more difficult to find sort of greenfield opportunities that will give you extraordinary returns. Much more competition. I think across the board, businesses are seeing slower revenue growth, higher costs, so that gives you margin compression. Difficult. So that's hard. But I know your question is really more from a policy point of view, and we're always talking about U.S.-China business relations. So from that perspective, what do we see going on? I think business in that sense, I would say in a policy sense, is about the same. Life in China as a foreigner, much more difficult. Okay, so that's a key point. So I think you are going to be hearing foreigners coming out of China saying, wow, this is really tough. And part of that is, and that's driving a process of localization. I think a lot of our businesses are seeing fewer and fewer foreigners running those businesses. They're mostly run by local people at this point. And part of this is actually just sort of a natural progression of the maturing of the Chinese economy. You're seeing more maturity in the labor force, and so you're seeing those kinds of things. But there is also, is China becoming less friendly or less welcoming to foreigners per se? I would say yes and no. I mean, on the policy side, the internet restrictions, VPN, things like that, across the board are making daily life more difficult for foreigners. But I think on a man on the street basis, foreigners are still very much welcome. So there's a split between kind of what the messaging out of Beijing versus kind of what the messaging is at the local level and provincial level. While we're talking, I'll offer up a stab at Ken's the transparency aspect on that. Ken and I actually talked extensively on that number. It surprised both of us, and my first response was statistical anomaly, of course. But no, we pondered it quite a bit, and I'll offer up one possible solution. And I think Ken's right. The most useful way to use that survey is looking at apples to apples and oranges to oranges, go back historically and look at it. However, you have to consider the fact that the respondents are not the same. The questions may be the same, the American Chamber is the same, the people are different. And if you look at the demographics of the American Chamber, it has shifted dramatically. So if you look at a decade ago, 15 years ago, the proportion of foreign Americans, if you will, American citizen holders that were in that population answering that specific question about transparency. You fast forward, Ken, are we about 50% quote unquote local? Over 50%. So, and even today it's a little bit hard to even know what is local and what's foreigner, right? This line gets blended. So my point being, the transparency of what's going on in China is very different to a person who was born and raised there versus somebody who was not, right? So that's just kind of a quick point on transparency. Yeah.
That's super helpful, and I think over time you see staff localize their perspective changes on a lot of different things. Let's move to Gentry.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to give you a combination answer, I guess. Okay. First, with respect to what we do as a law firm, a foreign law firm operating in China, my first short answer is that it's roughly the same or a little bit harder to do business than it was 10, 11 years ago. The reason for that, there are several reasons for that. One, we have a lot more competition now from local law firms. And those local law firms have become more mature. They're in some cases huge, and they are taking a lot of the market share that used to be enjoyed by foreign firms as far as representing foreign companies coming to China. That's one thing. We've also therefore had a lot of influence from those local firms with the Ministry of Justice in China, and we've had a lot of non-cooperation, I would call it, with the Ministry of Justice as far as licensing of foreign lawyers, the length of time that takes. It takes up to a year now to get a work permit as a foreign lawyer and to get a residency permit with that. So that's some of the regulatory things that we see as far as licensing by itself. The atmosphere for us, of course, is usually in the context of crisis management, right? So we have our clients coming to us when they've got some of those problems that we saw discussed there. So the IPR issues, which continue, issues relating to transparency of the laws, and those are factors that make it difficult for them to do business. And I can talk a little bit, therefore, as Pilar did, about what we see with our clients. And we still see a great amount of investment coming into China. We still set up a lot of greenfield projects, and in the context of those projects, which are wholly foreign-owned entities, our clients seem to be doing very well and operating relatively smoothly. They have been staying away from joint ventures or other vehicles to the extent they don't have to form a joint venture. Those that do have a more difficult time, it seems, working with their joint venture partners, and that's particularly true in automotive and some other industries as well. So we see that those that are working on their own have been doing pretty well. Clearly, those that have been there for a long time, who are expanding or adding investment, they are doing pretty well too. And part of that transparency number in the survey, I wonder if some of that is not that the basis of a response is coming from companies that have been doing business for a long time and therefore know their way around and find things just to run more smoothly and appear more transparent. I don't know the answer to that. But I think that our typical client is seeing business as roughly the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I would also wonder if, thinking about that transparency question as well, since if answers about policy issues in a regulatory environment are partly shaped by your business experience. So if more companies are having more revenue, more profits, maybe everything looks a little bit rosier, not quite as challenging. I don't know. So from what I hear from all of you is that there are some specific regulatory challenges, maybe some that have risen up recently, but this is sort of a long evolution of a market that is changing and maturing, where you've got real competition, you've got real increase in costs. These are not things that are going to just change if the lineup in Beijing changes or in the party secretary in Shanghai changes. So in Washington, we pay a lot of attention to things like Made in China 2025 and the 19th Party Congress. We think they're important, and we're going to continue to focus on them. But from the perspective of your companies and those that you advise, are those things that are significant but things that they're paying less attention to than just the rising costs and the competitors that you see from your Chinese local opponents, or where is your big focus?
Yeah, and I can start.
And anybody feel free to jump in on that.
Sure. So I think, put your hat on that is more commercial oriented. And think about how it is that these executives are expected to be outperforming every market that they play in around the world. China is supposed to be, as you've seen here, their number one priority. So any executive that is placed, whether it be an expat or a local, as a leader within a U.S. entity in China is expected to be a star performer. So they are very much focused on the commercial, and when they're looking through a commercial lens and they hear about things like One Belt, One Road, Made in China 2025, they are looking at it from the commercial opportunity standpoint. How does this achieve a return on investment that we're making here? How does this further my own agenda at improving our footprint and our market access within this region? And some of the ways in which they see that, well, I'm learning in my time here in DC this week that the lens from this point of view is much more about China taking over the world. The viewpoint from there is, how do I get a piece of the action? So when we're advising companies in the manufacturing space, it is, okay, so you're serving EPCs or system integrators on the infrastructure development within China, and infrastructure in China is going a little flat. However, all these Chinese companies are starting to go outbound because, hey, Belt and Road incents me to do so. So now what's happening is you're starting to see a lot of relationship forging that goes beyond the China border, but it's still between a US and a Chinese entity. So you have Chinese companies going into Africa, you have Chinese entities going into the stands. And as they're expanding out there, they're still needing that supply base of those partners that they have forged who are US entities and suppliers, but they've been working with them in China. So this is really the lens that I would argue many multinationals, American multinationals in China, are viewing these kinds of industrial policies. I do believe that they sense the squeezing out concept. There is a lot of domestic content that comes as sort of a subtitle or a side note or a footnote with these investment opportunities. How much of these funds are really available to foreign enterprise as opposed to Chinese enterprise? That is absolutely known and recognized and obvious. These executives in China are not fools. But I think the key is there's still a sliver of opportunity. And so as a commercial person wearing your commercial hat, think about the way in which they see this as a benefit to their operation. And the other thing I would just highlight is expansion for these US companies, whether it be in China or Kazakhstan, is going to mean more supply chain jobs for component manufacturers in Milwaukee and in Texas. So it does complete the entire circle.
When we hear about the Made in China 2025, we try to keep it in context relative to other initiatives that have also gone on. We are familiar with renminbi internationalization. After that, it became the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. Now it's One Belt, One Road. Then we have Made in 2025, all of them with various degrees of success. So in that sense, it's hard for us to directly evaluate what the outcome would look like. But certainly from a financial services side, we will pay attention to the implications on capital controls, because financial services, we're in the business of mobilizing capital to where it's most allocated. So depending on how these initiatives play out, the degree of capital coming into China or the extent that capital can freely leave China, that's something we're going to be paying close attention to.
Sure. Yeah. Just some quick thoughts. I have similar views to Pilar on this, and it bothers me a lot, to be honest with you. When I'm here in Washington, we're hearing a lot about China is so unfair, and we're not hearing at all about how is China doing that. Right. So this is a really important distinction. In other words, and it ties back to the manufacturing 2025. I mean, nobody's really asking the question, how is it that China is being so effective and so efficient and so successful with their economy and their businesses? Now, I understand we're in a policy environment, and that's kind of what we do here in Washington, is we think about the legislation and trade agreements and this and that, and I get it. Yeah, China has cheated on WTO and et cetera, et cetera. That's all true. It's also true that they are innovating the heck out of us. They are beating our pants off. One of the things that's really disturbing, that we've been here 48, 72 hours now, nobody's asked us at all about fintech. Not one single question from anybody. And that is not a trade dispute. It's not a WTO thing. I mean, yes, we can talk about electronic payment systems, and we've been talking about that. But the fact is right now, and I don't know, maybe people in this room actually know this, but this is a fact, is that China is not just ahead of us, ahead of everybody in fintech. They're ahead of us by a mile. And the question is, how are they doing that, and what's wrong with us? Why aren't we doing? Where's the USA manufacturing 2025? What are we going to do? We're sitting around complaining about manufacturing jobs going away and this and that. Where's the plan, right? So, I mean, the fact is that China and India are going to be putting massive amounts of labor into the world economy for decades to come. That is simply what the sun comes up on. That's reality. In the United States, we have to develop a plan to account for that. And instead of, so it just bothers me that we should be doing both. We should be looking at China in terms of trade agreements and playing by the rules. Although this whole thing about fairness also bothers me, is because fairness is just such a relative term. And I think what bothers me about it is my sense is that when we say China's not being fair, what we really mean is, why doesn't China act more like us, right? And I have to tell you, I mean, I'm not going to be the only one saying this. I mean, it is not going to happen. It is not. And China is not like us. They never have been, and they don't want to be. They do things their way, and the challenge is on us is to understand that and put a set of rules in place that everybody can agree to, abide by, and agree to be penalized by if they step out of line. That's really the direction that we should be taking, instead of just saying, well, it's unfair, or 2025, how dare you have an industrial plan? Well, there we are. Anyway.
That's unlikely to be turned away.
Well, I think Pilar and I see similar clients and similar activity and similar concerns when these policies are announced. And Pilar is absolutely right. The opportunity is the main goal, I think, that most of the management and the CEOs are going to be looking at when they see a policy announced by the government. They're going to, in turn, then look to me and Pilar to tell them what the threat is, to the extent that exists, and what does that mean in terms of competition or in terms of further regulation. And they're going to look to us to analyze those policies and give them advice on that. And I think Kerr is absolutely right on the whole thought process of where these things are going and why. And I think that's something that we all have seen on this trip is the lack of sort of a understanding of what's motivating those policies.
Sure. I just have this one reaction, and then I want to open it up to the audience. I think there's a little bit of a translation issue between what's going on in China and how you feel and how we read the surveys, all right? Because I think a lot of folks in Washington will read the surveys and see, oh, there's growing regulatory challenges, dissatisfaction, feeling like you're not treated as well, and then Washington's a do town, a get stuff done town, and like, okay, so how can we change that environment as opposed to, given the environment, here's how we should operate. And so for a lot of people here, it's a call to action for, oh, let's go whack the Chinese, as opposed to, okay, given this environment. So I think there's that struggle. Maybe that's a long-term struggle that we're having, but it's obviously very apparent right now because the Trump administration is trying to figure out what to do, having heard a lot of these challenges. Okay.
Well, I think, and I'm so sorry to interrupt.
No, it's good.
I was just going to say, because Scott, I think you were actually in Shanghai about maybe 8 or 9 months ago, and
Yes.
you brought up a very intriguing point to me, which was, these American companies in the U.S. have been banging the drum about requesting support from the U.S. government because there's all these unfair trading policies and practices. And now we finally are at a point where there's an administration, arguably, that's coming in supposedly to the rescue. And it's not that there's been a request for a rescue, but when you made that comment, it struck me because it's almost the survey results for the last 10, 15 years really haven't changed dramatically. And that's what I mean when I say same game, another day. The challenges are different, but the challenges are still pretty much at the same level. And what's fascinating to me is now that there is some appetite for change, and there is going to be some apparent adjustment or call to action, because now action is something that resonates more effectively with China. For some reason, that's the perception. Is the way in which the action is going to be taken, I think, is what American business is just hoping to have a voice at the table before anything comes down.
Super helpful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Why don't we collect several comments together and then give the panelists a chance to pick and choose. So we have a microphone. Please identify yourself, your institution. Try to keep your question and comment brief, and then again we'll try to collect several. We'll go with this gentleman right here who's got his hand up. Yes. First.
Thank you so much. Jake Schlesinger with the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for a fascinating panel. Just to key off the last question and comments, I'd be eager to hear your thoughts on the specific action that the administration has put forth or studied, the 301 on Chinese intellectual property. In what ways do you all think that's a good thing or a bad thing, or if it's mixed, sort of what gives you hope and what gives you anticipation?
Let's come right here, this gentleman.
Hi, Jack Goldstone, George Mason University. You mentioned fintech. I just wonder what other areas do you see China as moving ahead in product development? I know they're working on quantum communications, but faster trains, we don't make the best drones and so on. So what are the areas where U.S. firms will have a hard time competing?
Other questions? Right here, yes.
Hi, my name is Wendy from Boston University. So right now, China is undergoing the innovation and then the entrepreneurship. I want to know, like, how do American companies react to this trend? Thank you.
Just to your right, we have two people.
Kunio Kikuchi, Washington Research and Analysis. What happened to currency manipulation?
Yes.
Which is a major issue here.
Yes, yes.
Not what?
Yes, it's part of that translation issue. And the gentleman just to your right.
I'm Simon Erickson. I'm from the Motley Fool. I wondered if any of the panelists could speak about the technology industry. We've seen Google and Netflix and several other tech companies have protections against them in China. Do you see that continuing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. And we're going to get one more in the back. I'm sorry to make David run so much. But
Hello, Georgetown University, Tiona. I was curious to know, how do American companies react to Chinese relations with the neighboring countries, and if that affects any kind of business decisions?
okay. Great. So we've got a nice collection of questions related to 301. A couple questions related to where the Chinese performing really well in high tech. Google, China's neighbors, its relations. Maybe you're thinking about North Korea, perhaps. I don't. This is a stab in the dark. If it's okay, could we start at the end with Ken and come this way? Again, just take the questions that you'd like, and then you can leave the harder ones for your friends.
At this end of the chair.
Okay. So in this case, I'm happy to go first, is all I can say. I mean, currency manipulation strikes me as the easiest of the questions to address, because for our members, actually is not an issue that we've heard about for years. So keep in mind that for companies operating in China, they're operating largely in a renminbi ecosystem. A lot of them are reinvesting their profits into China. So for our members, this has not been a priority for us at all. And even by the the standard or the official definition of what would put you in the category of being a currency manipulator, even this administration has not concluded that China has hit that threshold. So it's not a significant issue for us. Can I wimp out? I'll just do that one, and then I want to leave enough for my colleagues, actually.
All right. Well, I can try on the 301. As we saw in the survey, and as I have my experience having worked on a lot of the IP matters that our clients face, that continues to be a challenge, and I think we probably all would agree that the idea of the 301 action is a good one. What I think we'd like to hopefully have is some input to the when the action gets to the point where remedies are considered, that there's some input from the business community, that we have a seat at the table, so to speak, for those type of actions when they're going forward.
Sure, I'll talk about the technology things, since I do invest in the technology space, and I was a technology banker in a previous life, so I'll talk about some of those things. To Wendy and to Jack, I'll answer your questions together. So what is Silicon Valley doing, or the American tech? Not much. They're sort of ignoring it, and they're not going over there to take a look at what's happening. Jack, to yours, come on over and take a look. Please do. You will be amazed at the number, the variety of things that you can do on a smartphone in China. It is far beyond what you can do here. It's, I mean, just 2 words for you: WeChat. You know, it's an extraordinary. Yeah, it's a 1-word. Thanks.
Just say it really
Yeah,
slowly.
it's slowly. No, it's extraordinary. And these are all related, actually, to Motley Fool. What's going to happen with Google and Facebook? Nothing whatsoever. Not until. So it's about control. And if Mark Zuckerberg, he can read all the books by Xi Jinping and study Chinese and all this other stuff, that's fine, that's beautiful. Until he becomes a Chinese person, and what I mean by that is live in China and be within the reach of the Chinese government. And that's where, I mean, Robin Lee, Jack Ma, they all have US passports, don't get me wrong. But they are under the thumb of the Chinese government. There's no question about it. If they want to reach out to those guys and grab them by the neck, they can. Zuckerberg, he's on a yacht. You know, he's not within the reach of the Chinese government. So that's not going to happen. But back with the connection between these two. So one of the big problems in China is it's never one thing or all the other, right? It is the proverbial elephant being described by the blind men, right? I mean, it's everything. So yes, there have been restrictions. No, that's not why WeChat is so successful. It's innovation. Tencent has Pony Ma. Those guys have studied everything. They know so, and this is true in general, is they know so much more about us than we know about them. So if you go to your average tech entrepreneur, he knows in China, he knows everything about what's going on in Silicon Valley, in Route 128, Berlin. They know. They're studying all that stuff. Guy in Silicon Valley, hey, what's going on in fintech in China? No idea whatsoever. You know, so that's an issue, and I kind of feel like the United States has been in a little bit of a bubble there.
I'll add some comments about the technology growth in China and how American companies would respond to this. So certainly China seems to be getting to become a more fertile technology environment. You have Beijing, which has Beijing University and Tsinghua. You've got southern China and Hangzhou, Shanghai. They're all fertile grounds for technology. But more importantly, there's a synchronization with education policy as well. For example, I have two daughters. Although I'm a US citizen, my two daughters go to the international side of a local public school. And my wife recently told me that the education policy has started to mandate that elementary schools start incorporating coding into their education as well. So you already get a sense of how the government is going to try to influence the directional development of technology at a younger generation. Now, another observation somebody once made was that half of the chief scientists in Silicon Valley were from China, okay, and that many of them could very well repatriate back to China as well. So I don't know whether that's true or not, but what has become clear is this. As US companies figure out how to take advantage of it, there have been increases in corporate venture capital of large multinationals setting up shop in China to look for ways to harvest this technology as it relates to their own technology ecosystem. Okay? So that should be something worth watching very carefully. But what is also worth watching is this. Even if corporate venture capital firms look to acquire technology, it's not going to always be that easy due to limitations. For example, it's not easy to invest in social media in China. But the challenge is this. On the surface, that looks reasonable because China does have control over information. But if you're a Chinese shoe company and you decided to one day have a blog to ask for customer feedback, that very addition also makes you a social media company as well. Does that mean the shoe company is now locked as an investment process to prevent US companies from investing in it? Those are some of the ambiguities that do exist today, and we hope that there's more clarification going forward.
And that leaves our neighbors. The question related to neighboring countries. And I think, you know, I am going to steer clear a bit now from the North Korea conversation with the one exception, and I thought maybe Han would touch on this, but the recent banking regulation.
Yeah.
And maybe you can shed a little bit more light, but essentially China was instructed, for all intents and purposes, to sever any ties with North Korean funds that were coming in or out. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe you can share a bit on that, and then I can touch on trading partners.
Well, certainly for every action, there's a reaction. And as North Korea becomes higher on the radar for security-related issues, China is going to be considered a partner in helping to generate security outcomes. And certainly a key partner would be the Chinese financial system. So we continue to watch as US banks, for example, how the Chinese financial system responds to these. Because finance and financial systems are interconnected all over the world. That's how you move capital around. So the biggest lenders and borrowers in the world are banks lending from one bank and borrowing from another bank. So to see how these Chinese banks respond to this security-related event is going to be of importance to the US financial system as well, because China, even today, despite renminbi internationalization, 70+% of China's trade is still denominated in US dollars, and the Chinese banks are heavily reliant on the US banks to process these payments because of the US banks' access to the US dollar clearing systems. So it is something unusual for US banks as well to see the financial system being used as a way to generate security outcomes.
And a short answer just in terms of neighbors as it pertains more to a trading partner relationship, I mean, I would actually draw us back again to some of the industrial policies that are on the table right now. I think that as you look at the way US companies operate in China and you just track that evolution, people in Shanghai will often say, you know, it started out with made in China, then it went into made in China for China. Now it's about R&D designed in China for China. And it's even evolving at this stage to design in China for Asia and region. And what's really trying to happen or evolve amongst, again, foreign enterprise that is operating in China is, yes, China is the gorilla in the room, but these trading partners with whom they have very decent trading relationships, more competitive taxation, easier ways in which to trade and transact with Southeast Asia or other parts of the Middle East. This is a very appealing reality for operators, US operations in China. So I see that the ongoing relationship between China and other countries is something that commercially American businesses applaud. I think they have, you know, one eye open on the finances and the benefits, and the other eye open on what is the ulterior motives involved here.
I've learned a ton today. Let me just, one little example. Yesterday I was in San Jose, California, and I was visiting a Shanghai company. A Shanghai company that's in the automotive sector, has employees from 80 countries, is doing design work there for an electric car that they're going to be selling in China soon, as well as work on autonomous vehicles that they hope to eventually sell. Could you call it a Shanghai company? It's very different. It doesn't make you think of what Chinese companies used to be like. And I think the big lesson I take away from the discussion today that all of you taught us is that look at what is happening in China, not what we want to happen, and engage and respond to that. So the view from Shanghai looks very different from the view from Washington, and it's really helpful to all of us, and I think your visit is really important, particularly at this time. And so Pilar, Han, Kerr, Gentry, and Ken, thank you so much. Everyone, please join me in thanking them.